Welcome back, Wasteland Wanderers. Today's lore is going to shatter everything you thought you knew about the Great War and its aftermath. We're diving deep into one of Fallout's most terrifying unexplored mysteries. The lore begins now. I found it in a waterlogged footlocker beneath the Yangtze, Captain Zhao's submarine, a transmission log he'd been hiding for 200 years. The Americans believed they'd destroyed China completely, but you can't kill an empire that learned to live in the dark. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about the Great War. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I was scavenging through Boston Harbor when I met him. Zhao, the ghoulified Chinese submarine captain who'd been waiting in that rusted tomb since the bombs fell. Most people who find him either kill him or help him repair his reactor. I did neither. I asked him the question nobody else had the guts to ask. Captain, what's really waiting for you back home? The look in those radiation-scarred eyes told me everything. He knew something he'd been carrying like a lead weight for 2 centuries. After I passed his speech checks, earned his trust, he finally showed me a data tape, encrypted, Chinese military protocol. It took me 3 weeks to crack it using terminal fragments I'd scrounged from the Fujinia intelligence base beneath Mama Dolce's processing plant. That facility was a nightmare. Chinese intelligence operations buried deep in Appalachia, part of something they called Operation Trinitite. The goal? Infiltrate American nuclear silos and factory cities. They didn't quite succeed, but what I found there led me down a path I can't come back from. The Fujinia base had more than just stealth technology and Liberator robot schematics. There were communications logs, transmissions sent back to Beijing in the final hours before the Great War. Desperate, frantic, but not hopeless, the station chief, a man named Shi, had ordered his agents to abandon their posts and blend with the local population when the bombs started falling. He figured the party leaders were dead. All operatives were on their own. But here's the thing. One of those final transmissions mentioned something called Homeland Protocol. I'd heard whispers of it before. Back when I helped the settlers raid Vault 79, I met Agent Mochu, a ghoulified Chinese spy who'd been hiding in a bunker called the Deep Beneath the White Spring. Her daughter Jen didn't even know her mother had been People's Liberation Army. 200 years, and Mochu still remembered her orders, still carried that stealth suit like it was sacred. When I asked her about going home, about China, she went quiet. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Home remembers us, even if we've forgotten home. I started connecting pieces. The Shi in San Francisco, descendants of the submarine Shi Huangti that washed ashore after the Great War. They'd built an entire society from the wreckage, stripped their submarine for parts, created the Steel Palace. Their emperor, the ship's old mainframe, kept detailed historical records. They weren't just survivors. They were waiting for something. Their researchers were working on radiation-resistant plants, trying to synthesize new fuel, experimenting with genetics. Why? Why pour resources into long-term research if you're just another Wasteland faction scraping by? Then there's Captain Zhao himself. He told me the Yangtze struck a mine after firing its missiles. 6 warheads launched at the Commonwealth. The reactor leak ghoulified his entire crew. For 200 years, he's been stranded in Boston Harbor, watching his men turn feral one by one, refusing to harm them because they're family. But when I helped him repair that reactor, when I got the dampening coil installed and the nuclear fuel loaded, he said something I can't forget. I do not want to bring the fire home. I don't want to bring fire home. The fire. Like there was something specific waiting there, something that couldn't handle another weapon. I started digging deeper. Pre-war documents from the Fujinia base mentioned Chinese biological weapons programs, not just conventional bioweapons. They were developing something parallel to America's forced evolution virus. The file called it Huanjing Bianyi, environmental adaptation. They'd been exposing populations to controlled radiation before the war even started, trying to create workers who could survive in contaminated zones. Human experimentation on a scale that made vault tech look tame. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. I found evidence of automated facilities. The Chinese had constructed massive underground factory complexes, specifically in mountainous regions. Tibet, the Himalayas, Inner Mongolia, places where elevation and geography provided natural shielding from nuclear blast waves. These weren't vaults in the American sense. They were production centers designed to run on automated systems for centuries. Mining, manufacturing, weapons assembly, all waiting for someone to come back and restart them. I cross-referenced this with intelligence reports I'd pulled from Sugar Grove, the American Signals Intelligence Facility. Right before the war, they detected unusual Chinese satellite activity, orbital construction. The files suggested China had managed to launch some kind of space station, minimal crew, likely as a final contingency. If even a handful of people survived up there, watching the world burn from orbit, they'd have a perspective nobody else had. They'd see which regions got hit hardest, which areas might still be habitable, where to send the survivors when the radiation finally settled. American forces had invaded mainland China in 2074. They'd taken cities, Nanjing, Shanghai, but the Chinese hadn't collapsed. They'd fought harder as the Americans pushed inland. Power, armor or not, terrain matters. China's vast. You can't occupy a country that size, not when supply lines are stretched across the Pacific and you're fighting on three fronts: Canada, Alaska, and the Chinese mainland. Something had to give. It gave on October 23rd, 2077. According to Tim Kaine, one of the original Fallout creators, China fired first. The first nuclear missile came from Chinese soil, launched at American targets. But why? They were losing the conventional war. American T-51 power armor units were decimating Chinese forces. Surrender was imminent. Why launch and guarantee mutual annihilation? Unless it wasn't about winning, unless it was about something else entirely. I found a holotape in the ruins of Mama Dolce's food distribution center in the capital Wasteland. A Chinese remnant captain had been carrying it. Encrypted, like everything else, but I'd gotten good at breaking Chinese military codes by then. It was a speech. Chairman Cheng's final address to the People's Liberation Army, recorded October 22nd, 2077. One day before the bombs fell. He didn't sound defeated. He sounded resolute. He talked about the long winter and the dynasty that endures through ash. He mentioned something called Operation Eternal Dynasty, a multi-phase plan that would ensure China's ideology outlives the nuclear fire. The recording cut off before he explained the details, but the implication was clear. They'd planned for this, maybe not the exact date, maybe not the specific circumstance, but they'd prepared for the possibility that the war would end in nuclear exchange. Think about it. If you knew nuclear war was inevitable, if you had years to prepare, what would you do? You'd hide your best people, your scientists, your engineers, your military commanders. You'd preserve your culture, your language, your system of government. You'd create contingencies, multiple layers, redundancies. You'd make sure that even if 99% of your population died, that 1% could rebuild. The Fujinia intelligence base terminal logs mentioned diaspora cells. The Xi weren't an accident. They were planned. Multiple Chinese submarines, multiple crews, scattered across the Pacific with orders to establish footholds wherever they landed. The Xi Huangti made it to San Francisco. The Yangtze ended up in Boston. How many others were there? How many more crews washed up on distant shores in places we haven't explored yet? And those Liberator robots, those autonomous Chinese combat drones that still patrol Appalachia 200 years later, they're not just mindless machines running on fading programming. They're networked. I've seen them coordinate, share tactical data, adapt to threats. That requires infrastructure, relay stations, maybe even satellite uplinks if some of those Chinese orbital platforms are still functional. I started noticing patterns in the wasteland. Chinese propaganda broadcasts that still play on certain frequencies, the People's Republic of America radio, transmitting from beacons scattered across the capital wasteland. Who's maintaining those? Who's keeping the transmitters powered after 2 centuries? Radiation doesn't explain it. Automated systems don't explain it. Someone, somewhere, is making sure those broadcasts continue. Then, there's the stealth technology. The Chinese were on the verge of a major breakthrough at Fujinia, improving power efficiency for their stealth suits. The Enclave salvaged their research after the war, created Stealth Boy Mark IIIs, but the base specs, the original designs, those came from China. Advanced metallurgy, quantum field manipulation, energy systems we still can't fully replicate. Where did they get that technology? How far ahead were they really? I found maps in the Fujinia base, not tactical maps of West Virginia, strategic maps of China itself. They'd marked locations, hundreds of them, bunker complexes, research facilities, what they called Phoenix sites. The files suggested these locations were designed to activate automatically if contact with Beijing ceased for more than 90 days. Self-contained command centers, each with its own power supply, its own stockpile of resources, its own set of protocols for rebuilding. If even a fraction of those sites survived the nuclear exchange, if even 10% activated as planned, that's still dozens of operational facilities scattered across Chinese territory. Cut off from each other? Yes. Isolated, certainly, but functional, waiting. I intercepted a signal once while I was tuning my Pip-Boy's radio through obscure frequencies. Mandarin, clear as day, a voice repeating coordinates, a date, a recognition code. The transmission lasted 6 seconds, then went silent. I've never heard it again. I've tried, but I know what I heard. Beijing was hit hard during the Great War. Had to be. It was China's capital, their command center. But China isn't just Beijing. It's a massive nation, over 9 million square kilometers. You can't eradicate a country that size, not completely. There are river valleys in the interior that might have escaped direct strikes, mountain ranges where people could shelter, deserts where radiation would disperse differently than in urban centers. If you were smart, if you'd planned for decades, you'd hide your continuity of government facilities in those places, far from the coasts, far from the obvious targets. The more I dug, the more I realized something unsettling. Every Chinese survivor I'd encountered, every scrap of Chinese technology I'd found, they all pointed to the same conclusion. China hadn't just survived, China had prepared. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you in the next part will make you question everything you thought you knew about who really won the Great War. This breakthrough came when I found the second data cache, not from Captain Zhao this time, from somewhere much more dangerous. I'd heard rumors about a pre-war Chinese bunker system beneath Point Lookout, that irradiated swampland off the Maryland coast. Most people who go there don't come back the same. The local tribals, the punga fruit hallucinations, the radiation fog, it's a special kind of hell. But I had to know. I found it 3 kilometers offshore, partially submerged. A Chinese covert submarine, designation SSN 37-1A, smaller than the Yangtze, designed for infiltration rather than missile strikes. The hull was breached, most of the interior flooded, but the command deck had remained sealed. Inside, I found skeletal remains in Chinese naval uniforms and a locked safe that had somehow survived 2 centuries of saltwater corrosion. The documents inside changed everything. They were sailing orders, dated October 15th, 2077. 8 days before the bombs fell, the submarine had been part of a larger operation called Lieguo, the Split Nation. According to these orders, dozens of submarines like this one were deployed along American coastlines with a singular mission. When the nuclear exchange began, they were to surface, document the damage, and transmit the data back to 3 specific locations. The coordinates were listed: 1 in northern China, 1 in the central region, 1 in the south. 3 locations, 3 separate command centers. The file called them the 3 Republics. It wasn't a plan for China to survive as one nation. It was a plan for China to fragment into three autonomous regions, each capable of independent operation, each preserving a piece of the whole. Northern Republic, Central Republic, Southern Republic. If one fell, the others would continue. If contact was lost, each would assume leadership had devolved to them. It was brilliant in its paranoia. But here's what made my hands shake as I read those documents. The sailing orders included expected timetables for reunification protocol. Not if reunification would occur, when. The document projected that by the year 2150, enough time would have passed for radiation levels to decrease, for infrastructure to be partially rebuilt, for the three republics to reestablish contact with each other. That's 73 years from now. They planned for a timeline measuring in centuries. I started researching American pre-war intelligence more aggressively after that. The Sugar Grove facility had been monitoring Chinese communications right up until the bombs fell. Their last intercepts, the final transmissions they decoded before everything went dark, they painted a picture of coordinated withdrawal. Chinese forces across the American mainland had received simultaneous orders: fall back, disappear, survive, not surrender, not retreat to defensible positions, disappear into the American population. Agent Mocho in Appalachia, the scientists at Fujinia, the submarine crews who never made it back to sea. They weren't stragglers, they were seeds, planted in enemy territory with the understanding that they might be there for generations. Some, like Mocho, survived as ghouls and eventually integrated with local populations. Others probably died in the chaos. But some must have succeeded in blending in, learned English, changed their names, had children who had children who had children. Chinese DNA, Chinese culture, Chinese language, all hidden beneath American accents and wasteland survival skills. The Xi in San Francisco are the obvious example. By the year 2241, they'd become a major research and development powerhouse. They'd retain their customs, their language, their cultural identity. But the younger generations, according to records, were starting to rely more on popular culture interpretations of Chinese heritage rather than authentic traditions. Kung Fu holo videos instead of actual martial arts philosophy. It was both preservation and mutation, culture surviving by adapting. But what struck me was their technology level. The Xi could manufacture power armor. They had functioning industrial capability. They were researching nuclear power and considering methods of space travel. In the year 2241, less than 200 years after total nuclear annihilation, they were contemplating leaving Earth. That's not wasteland survival. That's civilization rebuilding, and they were doing it while locked in a power struggle with the Hubologists, dealing with gang violence, managing internal political disputes. Imagine what they could accomplish with stability, with resources, with contact from the mainland. I found evidence of that contact in the strangest place: a dead Xi merchant killed by raiders outside of New Reno. His body had been there for weeks, but nobody had looted one particular item. A data slate, encrypted with Chinese characters. When I finally cracked it, I found correspondence, trade negotiations, not with other wasteland factions, with someone called the Eastern Administrator. The messages referenced shipping routes across the Pacific, payment in pre-war technology, delivery schedules that assumed the existence of functional vessels capable of transoceanic travel. The Eastern Administrator, not a wasteland warlord's title, an administrative position, bureaucratic, organized, the kind of title that implies a functioning government structure. The messages dated from 2276, just 11 years ago. Someone in China was trading with the Xi, someone with resources, with ships, with enough stability to maintain regular contact across thousands of kilometers of radioactive ocean. I started mapping it out. The Xi had their submarine's mainframe, the Emperor, maintaining historical records and advising their leadership. They had spies operating throughout San Francisco, keeping tabs on everything happening in the city. They had advanced weapons manufacturing, radiation-consuming plants that could clean contaminated soil, genetic research into creating super soldiers. All of this required planning, infrastructure, long-term thinking, the same kind of long-term thinking that creates three republics with reunification protocols. Then I found the transmission logs from the Yangtze. Captain Zhao had kept meticulous records. Every radio signal the submarine had detected since the Great War, most were random static, old emergency broadcasts, wasteland raider chatter. But starting in the year 2214, a new pattern emerged: regular pulses on a specific frequency, extremely low bandwidth, just enough to carry basic binary data. The pulses came from the west, from across the Pacific, from the direction of China. Zhao had never mentioned this. I don't think he wanted to acknowledge it, because if those pulses meant what I thought they meant, if someone in China was actively broadcasting, trying to contact survivors, then his 200 years of isolation had been partially self-imposed. He could have tried to respond. He could have attempted to rebuild his transmitter, to send a message back, but he didn't. Maybe he was afraid of what he'd find. Maybe he was ashamed of launching those missiles. Maybe he just couldn't face going home to a China that had moved on without him. The binary data I pulled from those transmissions, once I decoded it, it was simple. A repeating message. 4 Chinese characters. Dengdai mingling. Await orders. Over and over. For decades, someone was telling Chinese survivors to wait, to maintain their positions, to preserve what they could. Orders were coming. Eventually, I cross-referenced this with what I knew about Chinese military doctrine. The People's Liberation Army had always emphasized patience, long-term strategic thinking, surviving through adversity. They'd fought the Japanese for 8 years during World War II, fought the Americans and Yin forces to a standstill in Korea, waged a decade-long war against the United States for control of Alaska and the Pacific. They understood protracted conflict. They understood that sometimes you have to lose battles to win wars, that sometimes the war doesn't end in your lifetime. What if the Great War wasn't the end for China? What if it was just another phase in a conflict they'd always planned to fight across generations? I found evidence of continued weapons development in the post-war period. The Mech-Gauss minigun, a Chinese design using electromagnetic technology to fire 2mm ammunition at over 90,000 rounds per minute. The technical sophistication required to build that weapon, it doesn't emerge from random wasteland scavenging. It requires functional research facilities, trained engineers, access to rare materials, and precision manufacturing. Someone was building advanced weapons. Someone was iterating on pre-war designs, making them better. The Liberator robots provided another clue. Yes, they'd been developed before the war at Fujinia, but the ones still active in Appalachia, they'd received firmware updates. I verified this by comparing the combat algorithms of Liberators found in different regions. The ones near Mama Dolce's, close to the old Chinese intelligence base, they fought with more sophisticated tactics than the ones scattered randomly across the wasteland. Someone had accessed them, refined their programming, made them more effective. Then there was the question of the stealth suits. Agent Mo Chu had one, a functional Chinese stealth suit, still operational after 200 years. The technology had been cutting edge before the war, and the Fujinia researchers were improving it right up until the bombs fell. But Mo Chu's suit, when I examined it before she gave it to her daughter Jen, it had modifications I didn't recognize. Improvements to the power cell, enhanced radiation shielding, better thermal management. Someone had upgraded it recently, within the last 50 years, based on the component aging. Where did those parts come from? Who did the work? Mocho had been hiding in the deep, cut off from the surface for decades. She couldn't have done it herself, unless she wasn't as isolated as she'd claimed, unless she'd had contact, visitors, fellow agents who'd maintained the old networks. I started thinking about Chairman Cheng's final speech, that recording about Operation Eternal Dynasty. Ensure China's ideology outlives the nuclear fire. Not China, the nation, not China, the territory. China, the idea, the culture, the language, the political philosophy, the collective identity of over 1 billion people condensed into a transmissible code. You can't destroy an idea with nuclear weapons. You can only kill the people who carry it. And if enough people survive, if they pass it on to their children, if they maintain the traditions and the language and the customs, then the idea persists. The Xi proved this. 200 years removed from mainland China, descended from a single submarine crew, and they still identified as Chinese. They still used the language, still followed hierarchical organization patterns that echoed pre-war Chinese society. They'd built a feudal system with an emperor, guards, researchers, spies. It was a microcosm of Chinese civilization, adapted for wasteland survival, but fundamentally unchanged in its core structure. If one submarine crew could maintain that much cultural continuity, what could millions of survivors do? Because that's the math that kept haunting me. China had a population of over 1.4 billion people before the war. Even if 99% died in the nuclear exchange and its immediate aftermath, that's still 14 million survivors, spread across 9 million square kilometers of territory. 14 million people with shared language, shared culture, shared understanding of how to organize, how to rebuild, how to endure. The United States had maybe 300 million people before the war. We got hit just as hard, probably harder since we were more urbanized, more concentrated in cities that made prime targets. But we've got the new California Republic, the Brotherhood of Steel, the Enclave Remnants, the Institute, dozens of other factions that have managed to build something resembling civilization out of the ashes. If we could do that with our population density and our infrastructure damage, what could China accomplish with potentially millions more survivors scattered across a much larger area? I found a holotape in an abandoned caravan outside of New Vegas. The trader had been dealing in pre-war artifacts, and one of his acquisitions was a Chinese language instruction program recorded in 2283. 4 years ago, someone was still teaching Chinese. Someone thought it was important enough to create educational materials to preserve the language for future generations. The recording quality was too good to be pre-war. It had been made recently using functional recording equipment by someone who spoke fluent Mandarin. If this story has kept you listening this far and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. The pieces were connecting. The three republics, maintaining separate continuity, the diaspora cells, Chinese survivors scattered globally awaiting orders, the technological development continuing in hidden facilities, the regular transmissions trying to contact survivors, the cultural preservation efforts, the long-term planning that measured success in centuries rather than years. It all pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. China hadn't died. China had gone underground, and now, 200 years later, they were coming back. I made a mistake, a stupid, reckless mistake that nearly cost me everything. I tried to respond to one of those transmissions from across the Pacific, the binary pulses that said await orders in Chinese. I jury-rigged a radio transmitter using parts from the Yangtze, components I'd scavenged from the Fujinia base, and a power supply I'd borrowed without asking from a Brotherhood of Steel outpost. It took me 3 months to build something capable of reaching across the ocean. When I finally sent my signal, a simple ping on the same frequency, the response came within hours. Not the automated pulse I'd been tracking. Something different. A voice, speaking Mandarin, clear, crisp, no static, like they were broadcasting from the next room instead of across thousands of kilometers of radioactive wasteland. The message was brief. Identification required. State your designation and operational status. Military protocol. Formal. Exactly what you'd expect from an organized command. Structure that had maintained discipline for 2 centuries. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because responding meant revealing I wasn't who they thought I was. I was an American wastelander who'd stumbled onto their frequency, And that meant I knew too much. The broadcast stopped after that. The regular pulses, the await orders signal, all of it went silent. I'd spooked them. Whoever was out there, they knew someone unauthorized had tapped into their network. I'd blown my only chance at direct confirmation, but in a way, the silence confirmed everything. They wouldn't shut down a dead frequency. They wouldn't change protocols unless they were actively monitoring, actively protecting operational security. I had to find another way in. So, I went back to the physical evidence. The maps I'd found at Fujinia showed hundreds of Phoenix sites scattered across Chinese territory. I started analyzing the placement patterns, looking for logic in the distribution. They weren't random. Northern sites clustered around mountainous regions. Central sites followed major river systems inland, away from coastal targets. Southern sites concentrated in areas that had historically been agricultural centers. Three distinct patterns, three separate survival strategies. The Northern Republic would focus on mining, on extracting resources from mineral-rich mountains. The Central Republic would control water, the lifeblood of any civilization. The Southern Republic would preserve agriculture, food production, the foundation of population sustainability. Each region specialized in what it could do best, what its geography supported, and together, once reunification occurred, they'd have everything needed for comprehensive rebuilding. But that was the plan on paper. What had actually happened? I needed ground truth, not 200-year-old contingency documents. That's when I remembered something Captain Zhao had mentioned in passing. Before I'd helped him with the reactor, when he was still wary of me, he'd talked about other submarines, other Chinese vessels he'd detected on his sonar over the years. Most had been American ships, Wasteland traders, raider vessels, but twice, just twice in 200 years, he'd picked up a signature that matched Chinese submarine acoustics, different from the Shi Huangti, different from the Yangtze, something else. The first contact had been in 2112. The submarine had surfaced briefly near the edge of Boston Harbor, stayed for approximately 6 hours, then disappeared back into the depths. Zhao hadn't investigated. He couldn't risk the Yangtze's damaged reactor, but he'd listened to their radio traffic before they submerged. They'd been speaking Mandarin, reporting their position, requesting updated orders. They'd used a call sign, Dongfang Chi, Eastern 7. The second contact came in 2209, a different vessel, larger, based on the acoustic signature. It had remained submerged the entire time, just passing through Boston Harbor on its way north. Zhao had detected it purely by chance when one of his still functional sensors picked up the thermal signature from its reactor. This one had been designated Beifang San, Northern 3, Northern, as in Northern Republic. 2 submarines, 2 different designations suggesting a larger fleet. Operational boats crewed by people who knew how to run them, who maintained the vessels across centuries, who followed patrol routes and communication protocols. That's not wasteland scavenging, that's a functional navy. I started looking for other evidence of Chinese maritime activity. Trade routes between the Shi and the mainland would require ships, regular ships, not just lucky survivors on one-way trips. I combed through Shi records, merchant logs, any documentation I could find in San Francisco. Most of it had been destroyed when the Hybologist had escalated their conflict with the Shi, but I found fragments. Shipping manifests that listed arrivals from eastern ports, dates, cargo contents, payment arrangements. The manifests were coded, obviously. The Shi weren't advertising their mainland contacts, but the pattern was clear. Every 3 to 5 years, a major shipment would arrive. Pre-war technology, rare materials, items that couldn't be manufactured in San Francisco. In exchange, the Shi sent finished goods, weapons, medicine, refined fuel. It was trade, organized, regular, sustained trade across the Pacific Ocean. One manifest caught my attention. Year 2278, just 9 years ago. The cargo list included something labeled Cultural Archive Restoration Materials, books, educational programs, historical documents, all in Chinese. Someone on the mainland was trying to recover lost knowledge, to rebuild libraries, to preserve the intellectual heritage that had survived the war. That's not survival behavior, that's rebuilding civilization behavior. I thought about the timeline. 200 years since the bombs fell. Enough time for 10 generations to be born and die. Enough time for radiation levels to drop significantly in areas that weren't direct strike zones. Enough time for nature to reclaim cities, for rivers to run cleaner, for soil to potentially support agriculture again. If you'd spent those 2 centuries underground, in mountain bunkers and river valley complexes, preserving your culture and your technology, waiting for the world above to become habitable again, 200 years would bring you right to the threshold of reemergence. The Three Republics Plan projected reunification by 2150. That was already 137 years ago. If they'd succeeded, if the northern, central, and southern regions had re-established contact and coordinated their efforts, they'd have had over a century to consolidate, to pool resources, to begin serious reconstruction, a century of organized effort by millions of survivors, using pre-war knowledge and post-war adaptations. What would that look like? I tried to imagine it. Picture vast underground cities, carved into mountain ranges and hidden in river valleys, powered by geothermal energy and salvaged nuclear reactors, populated by people who'd never seen the sun, who'd been born in artificial light, who'd learned to thrive in confined spaces. Entire generations raised on stories of the world above, taught that someday they'd reclaim it, trained from birth in the skills needed to rebuild. And the experimentation, the files I'd found about Huanjing Bianyi, environmental adaptation, they'd been exposing people to controlled radiation before the war, trying to create workers who could survive in contaminated zones. What if they'd continued that research? What if 200 years of genetic modification, of selective breeding, of controlled mutation had created something new? Not ghouls, shambling and decaying, something else. Humans adapted to high radiation environments. Humans who could walk through contaminated zones without protection, who could reclaim territory that would kill normal wastelanders. The evidence for this was thin, mostly speculation, but there were hints. Chinese combat armor designs I'd found in Fujinia showed unusual amounts of radiation shielding, far beyond what you'd need for normal battlefield conditions. Like they expected their soldiers to fight in environments that would be lethal to unmodified humans. And some of the medical research notes mentioned genetic compliance testing and radiation resistance markers. They were screening their population, looking for specific traits. If you combined radiation-resistant humans with 2 centuries of underground industrial development, you'd have the foundation for expansion. Send your modified workers to the surface, let them clear the ruins, establish outposts, begin farming in soil that would poison normal people. Slowly, methodically, reclaim your territory. No need to rush. You've planned for centuries. A few more decades means nothing. I found evidence of this surface activity in the strangest way. I was trading with a caravan master who'd come from far to the west, beyond New Vegas, beyond New California. He dealt in exotic goods, rare items from the fringes of explored territory. One of his prizes was a weapon, Chinese manufacture, a Type 93 assault rifle, but modified, upgraded. The serial number dated it to 2261. 26 years ago, someone in China was manufacturing weapons using pre-war designs but post-war materials and techniques. The caravan master claimed he'd gotten it from a trader who'd gotten it from a merchant who'd supposedly traveled across the Pacific. Fourth-hand information, impossible to verify, but the weapon was real. I examined it thoroughly. The metallurgy was sophisticated, the machining precise. This wasn't wasteland craftsmanship. This was industrial, production, quality control, standardization, all the hallmarks of organized manufacturing. I started wondering about the scope. If they were making weapons, they were making other things, tools, vehicles, infrastructure components. You don't maintain industrial capacity just to produce assault rifles. You build it because you're preparing for large-scale operations, because you need to equip thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands, maybe more. And then there was the question of population growth. Start with 14 million survivors immediately after the war. High mortality in the first few decades as radiation sickness and starvation took their toll. Let's say the population dropped to 8 million before stabilizing. But then, in the relative safety of underground bunkers with preserved food stores and medical knowledge, the population would start recovering. A conservative growth rate of 1% per year, accounting for limited space and resources, would still double the population every 70 years. Over 200 years, that's 3 doublings. 8 million becomes 16 million, becomes 32 million, becomes 64 million. 64 million people, all Chinese, all raised with the same cultural identity, the same language, the same understanding of their history and their purpose, all working toward the same goal: reunification, restoration, return to greatness. That's not a wasteland faction, that's a nation that had time to plan, to organize, to build its strength in secret while the rest of the world tore itself apart fighting over scraps. The Americans had the enclave, maybe a few thousand at their peak, the Brotherhood of Steel, scattered chapters totaling maybe 10,000 across the entire continent. The New California Republic, the largest organized force in the wasteland, maybe 700,000 people at most. And China, potentially 64 million, hidden across the Pacific, building, waiting, planning. I thought about what Captain Zhao had said. China remembers, even if America forgets. At the time, I thought it was just an old ghoul's nostalgia. But what if it was a warning? What if Zhao knew, had always known, that the homeland was still out there, that he could have gone back any time, that his 200 years of isolation had been self-imposed guilt rather than necessity? When I'd helped him repair the Yangtze, he'd given me tactical nuclear homing beacons as a reward. He'd said he didn't want to bring the fire home, but he'd kept those weapons for 2 centuries. Why? In case he needed them, in case someone came looking for him and he had to prove he was still loyal, still capable, still useful. Or in case someone came from the mainland and he needed to defend himself against his own people. I started having nightmares. I dream about fleets of Chinese submarines surfacing off the American coast. Not raids, not attacks, colonization, tens of thousands of radiation, resistant workers landing on beaches, moving inland, establishing settlements in the most contaminated zones where American wastelanders couldn't follow, claiming territory that we'd written off as uninhabitable, building outposts that would slowly expand, slowly connect, slowly encircle our fragmented factions, and we'd never see it coming, because we weren't looking west. We were too busy fighting each other. The NCR battling Caesar's Legion, the Brotherhood hoarding technology in their bunkers, the Institute conducting experiments beneath Boston, the Enclave trying to exterminate all mutated life. We'd turned inward, focused on our own regional struggles, forgetting that the war had been global, forgetting that China had been just as invested in survival as we'd been. I needed proof, real, undeniable evidence that what I suspected was actually happening, so I made a decision that would either confirm my theories or get me killed. I was going to China. I was going to cross the Pacific and see for myself what had risen from the ashes of the Great War, and what I found there would either save humanity or doom it forever. Getting to China wasn't as impossible as it sounds. The Xi had vessels, trade ships that made the crossing regularly. I couldn't just ask for passage. They'd never allow an outsider on a mainland run. So I stole aboard, hid myself in a cargo container marked for eastern ports, sealed myself in with enough food and water for 30 days, and hoped I'd survive the journey. The voyage took 42 days. 42 days in darkness, listening to the ocean pound against the hull, feeling the ship rise and fall with swells that threatened to tear it apart. I rationed my supplies carefully, but by day 35 I was down to my last bottle of irradiated water and a handful of cram. I started hallucinating, seeing my family from before the war, hearing voices that couldn't be there. I almost gave myself away a dozen times, almost screamed just to end the isolation. When the ship finally docked, when I felt the engines stop and heard the crew begin unloading, I waited until night. Then, I pried open my container and slipped into a world I wasn't prepared for. The port city stretched before me, and it wasn't ruins. It was functional. Intact buildings with lights in the windows, paved streets, people moving with purpose, speaking Mandarin, wearing clean clothes that weren't stitched together from scavenged rags. I'd expected wasteland. I'd found civilization. I hid for 3 days in that port city, stealing food, watching, learning. The city was called Shin Shanghai, New Shanghai, built on the ruins of the old, but built properly. Multi-story structures using pre-war concrete and post-war innovation. Solar panels on every roof, water purification systems that pulled from the Yangtze River, which still flowed despite everything. Gardens everywhere, growing crops I recognized and some I didn't. Radiation-resistant rice, modified soybeans, plants that had been engineered to thrive in contaminated soil. The people looked healthy, not the malnourished, radiation-scarred survivors I was used to seeing. These were well-fed, organized citizens of a functioning state. They wore uniforms, color-coded by occupation, red for laborers, blue for technical workers, green for agricultural specialists, gray for administrators, and black for military. I saw plenty of black uniforms, armed patrols, disciplined, alert, searching for something, searching for me. I realized the She crew had discovered my container, had reported the stowaway to local authorities. I was being hunted in a city where I didn't speak the language, didn't know the layout, and stood out like a ghoul in a vault. I needed to go deeper, get away from the coast, find the truth about the three republics. I managed to slip aboard a cargo train heading inland, freight cars loaded with manufactured goods, heading to what the shipping labels called Central Administrative Zone. The train ran on tracks that had been maintained, cleared of debris, kept functional through 2 centuries of deliberate effort. We passed through territory that should have been glowing craters. Instead, I saw villages, farms, people working fields, living their lives. The radiation was still there. I could feel it on my Pip-Boy, but it was manageable. And the people working those fields, they didn't seem bothered by it at all. That's when I understood. The genetic modification program hadn't just been theoretical. They'd done it, created a population that could tolerate radiation levels that would kill normal humans in days. These weren't mutants, they were adapted, evolution forced through deliberate selection and genetic engineering. 200 years of producing children with higher and higher radiation resistance until they'd created something new. Homo sapiens radiatus, humanity 2.0. The train journey took 5 days. 5 days of hiding, of watching the landscape transform from coastal reconstruction to inland development. I saw cities that had been completely rebuilt, factories with smokestacks belching industrial exhaust, power plants, huge complexes with cooling towers that suggested nuclear reactors, multiple reactors producing enough energy for millions of people. This wasn't survival. This was resurgence. When the train finally stopped, I was in the heart of the Central Administrative Zone, a massive city built partially underground, partially above surface. The above-ground portion looked like something from before the war. Wide boulevards, orderly buildings, monuments celebrating Chinese history and resilience. But the underground portion, which I glimpsed through ventilation grates and service tunnels, that was the real achievement. Kilometers of habitation, manufacturing centers, research facilities, a complete civilization sheltered beneath protective layers of earth and concrete. I spent 2 weeks infiltrating that city, learning its patterns, scavenging discarded documents, listening to broadcasts on public speakers, and what I learned terrified me. The three republics had indeed reunified. In the year 2146, just 4 years ahead of their projected schedule, representatives from the northern, central, and southern regions had met in what they called the Congress of Restoration. They'd established a unified command structure, pooled their resources, and begun coordinated rebuilding efforts. The population figures I'd estimated were conservative. According to the documents I found, the current population of unified China was approaching 90 million. 90 million people, all organized under a single government that called itself the Continuation Committee. Not the People's Republic, not a new dynasty, the Continuation Committee, because they saw themselves as the unbroken continuation of pre-war China, an empire that had paused, gone underground, but never truly ended, and their plans for expansion were already in motion. I found military deployment orders, expeditionary forces being prepared for overseas reclamation operations. The target regions weren't specified in the documents I accessed, but the logistics were clear. They were preparing to send thousands of people across the ocean, not refugees, not desperate survivors, organized colonists backed by military support and industrial capacity. Think about what that means. What happens when 90 million organized, radiation-resistant, technologically advanced Chinese citizens decide it's time to reclaim their pre-war territories? What happens when they look across the Pacific and see a fractured America, broken into feuding factions, still struggling with basic survival 200 years after the bombs fell? Do you think they'll see equals, or do you think they'll see opportunity? Leave a comment. Tell me what you'd do if you were in the Continuation Committee's position. I found something else in those underground archives: maps, detailed maps of the Western American coast. Not old maps, new maps, updated with current information, settlement locations, faction territories, resource deposits, strategic choke points. Someone had been surveying America recently, thoroughly. The level of detail was frightening. They knew where the NCR had established its strongholds. They knew about Brotherhood bunkers. They had locations for Enclave remnants, institute facilities, railroad safe houses. Every major faction in America had been cataloged, assessed, and categorized. The maps were marked with Chinese characters I had to look up: Yuxian Mubiao, priority targets, and the highest priority, San Francisco, the Shi, their own people. The maps indicated that the Shi were considered culturally compromised, too Americanized, too independent, too far removed from mainland authority. The plans suggested that the Shi would be reintegrated during the first wave of reclamation operations, forcibly, if necessary. That's when I realized the full horror of what was coming. The Continuation Committee didn't see the diaspora cells as allies. They saw them as assets to be reclaimed or liabilities to be neutralized. 200 years of separation had created cultural drift. The Shi had adapted to American wasteland culture. They traded with American factions. They'd integrated aspects of local customs into their society. From the mainland perspective, they'd been contaminated, corrupted. They needed to be purified, brought back into ideological alignment with proper Chinese values. I thought about Captain Zhao, about his reluctance to return home. Had he known this? Had he suspected that going back wouldn't be a homecoming but a reckoning? That he'd be judged for his 200 years of isolation, for his failure to maintain contact, for his choice to help an American wastelander instead of preserving his weapons for the motherland? I needed to get this information back to America, needed to warn people. But I was trapped in the heart of Chinese territory, being actively hunted with no way to contact anyone. That's when I made my second desperate gamble. I broke into a communications facility, used my Pip-Boy to interface with their systems, and I sent a burst transmission to every frequency I could reach: Shi channels, Brotherhood emergency bands, NCR military networks, even the Enclave's old encrypted channels. A simple message: China lives. China is coming. Prepare. The response was immediate. Alarms throughout the city, lockdown protocols. I ran through underground tunnels, through service passages, through areas where radiation levels would have killed a normal person in minutes. But I'd been living in the wasteland my whole life. My body had adapted, maybe not to Chinese levels, but enough to survive where they didn't expect me to. I made it to the coast, stole a small boat, barely more than a raft with a motor, and I crossed back. 37 days on the ocean. Storms, equipment failures, dehydration so severe I was drinking my own recycled urine. But I made it. Landed on the California coast half dead. More radiation scarred than before, but alive. The first settlement I reached was a Shi outpost. They took me in, treated my radiation sickness, listened to my story, and they didn't believe me. Thought I'd lost my mind. Radiation-induced psychosis, wasteland madness. They smiled and nodded and gave me stim packs and told me to rest. They didn't understand, couldn't accept that everything they'd built was about to be swept aside by a wave from the west. But I know the truth. I've seen it. I've walked through Chinese cities that shouldn't exist. I've read their plans. I've watched their soldiers train for operations that will reshape the post-war world. The Great War isn't over. It was never over. It just went into a very long intermission, and China spent that intermission preparing for the next act. If you were a leader in the NC or the Brotherhood, how would you defend against a force of 90 million? What strategies could possibly work against that kind of numerical and technological superiority? Drop your thoughts below. The Americans think they destroyed China completely, but you can't kill an empire that learned to live in the dark. While we were fighting over pre-war scraps, they were building underground cities. While we were struggling to grow mutated crops in contaminated soil, they were engineering humans who could thrive in radiation. While we were fragmenting into isolated factions, they were unifying under a single vision of restoration. And now they're coming. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but soon. The expeditionary forces are being assembled, the ships are being built, the soldiers are being trained, and when they arrive, they won't come as refugees or traders. They'll come as conquerors, as the rightful inheritors of a world that they believe betrayed them, as an empire that never truly fell, just retreated into darkness to wait for the perfect moment to return. I'm recording this as a warning, as evidence, as proof that what I saw was real, because I know what's going to happen to me. The Shi reported my story to their mainland contacts, confirmation that I'd penetrated Chinese territory, accessed classified information, transmitted warnings to American factions. I'm a loose end, a security breach, and the continuation committee doesn't leave loose ends. They're here now. I can hear them outside. Black uniformed soldiers, speaking Mandarin, surrounding this building. They crossed the Pacific faster than I did. They had real ships, not a stolen raft. They've come to silence me, to recover any evidence I might have gathered, to ensure that America remains ignorant until it's too late. But I've hidden the data, encrypted it, scattered it across the wasteland in caches that only someone really looking would find, and I've sent this recording out on every channel I can access. Maybe someone will listen, maybe someone will believe, maybe someone will prepare, or maybe you'll all dismiss it as the ravings of a radiation-addled scavenger. Maybe you'll go back to your petty faction wars and your territorial disputes and your squabbles over water and salvage. Maybe you'll ignore the warnings until Chinese ships appear on your horizon, and it's too late to do anything but surrender or die. They're breaking down the door now. I can hear the wood splintering. I've got maybe 30 seconds before they reach me, so I'm going to say this one last time, as clearly as I can. Chairman Cheng's final order wasn't to launch the nukes. It was to ensure China would rise again, no matter how long it took. And they did. They rose in the darkness, in the hidden places, in the deep earth where no one was watching, and now they're returning to reclaim what they believe is rightfully theirs. The Great War never ended. We just stopped paying attention, and that mistake is going to cost us everything. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. They're in the room. This is my last transmission. Remember what I told you. China remembers, even when America forgets, and what remembers can return. What returns can